Good afternoon and welcome back to the Ineffable Con 2. This is going really, really quickly, isn't it? We are delighted to welcome another of our special guests for this convention. We have with us today Marc Burrows, author of The Magic of Terry Pratchett, an excellent biography of some author called Terry Pratchett.
You may have heard of him.
He is going to do a reading for us today of one particular chapter of the book that might be of particular relevance to people here. And then afterwards, you will have a chance to ask questions. So do pop your questions in the Q&A tab on the Excel events chat. And thank you very much for being with us today. And we'll hand over to you.
Amazing. Am I on? Somebody tell me I'm on.
You are on.
Hi. I can't see anybody because looking at my own picture will distract me like a canary with a mirror. So I've turned myself off. So if I look weird or something happens, someone's going to have to find a way of letting me know. So hello, I'm Marc Burrows. It's lovely of you to join me. It's really nice to be here. I'm ridiculously excited about this. I'll tell you a little bit about me. I am an author, which I always get a kick out of saying. I'm a musician and I'm a stand-up comedian and I do far too many things. And people ask me how I do anything and I say by being tired all the time. But I'm here today because I'm an author, which is exciting. Earlier on in the year, I published this. Well, I didn't publish it. Some people who know about publishing published it. The Magic of Terry Pratchett. It's the first ever proper biography of Terry Pratchett. I worked very hard on it. I'm very, very proud of it. And it means a lot to me. I'm a huge Pratchett fan, have been for years. Huge Neil Gaiman fan as well. I first read Good Omens, God, it must have been about 1994. I was one of those people that Terry and Neil always talked about that had the copy that was held together with tape that looked like it had been dropped in the bath. It's always been one of my favorite books. I loved the show when it came back. So I'm really excited to be here and to be getting involved. So I thought what I'd do is I would read you the chapter because Good Omens is the only Pratchett book that has its own chapter in the book. So I'm going to read you the Good Omens chapter. Now, if you've read the book before, I am sorry, it's the same, but hopefully you'll get something out of it. Without further ado, whatever ado is, I will proceed to read. So we're going to do the chapter on Good Omens. Should take about 20 minutes, maybe half an hour at most, and then we'll do some questions and that sort of thing. I'm not actually in the chat, by the way. My wife is in the chat because I've not got it open because I'll get distracted by that as well. But if there's any technical problems, she will see it and will come and poke me. Hopefully not too violently because it'll put me off my stroke. Without further ado, Chapter 12, The Satanic Verses, the Making of a Cult Classic. Somewhere in 1985, shortly after he'd interviewed a part-time fantasy author and a full-time press officer in a restaurant in Soho, Neil Gaiman had an idea for a story. Like all the best ideas, it hinged on a simple, brilliant concept. Retell the plot of the classic horror movie The Omen in the style of Richmal Crompton's Just William books. He envisioned a mix-up at a hospital that meant the son of Satan, intended to be raised by a powerful American diplomat, grows up in a sleepy English village away from the influence of satanic powers. And at the same time, an inept demon... An inept demon who is less than thrilled at the prospects of impending Armageddon will attempt to put a spanner in the works. Gaiman worked on the first 5,000 words of the story. He called it William the Antichrist, bringing the tale up to the point where an incompetent satanic nurse mixed up two babies. And there he stopped because he didn't really know what happened next. Now, at the same time, he was working on an official companion book to Douglas Adams' The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which meant interviewing Adams extensively at his home in Islington, North London, and discussing the development of his most famous work. Inevitably, something of Adams' tone seeped into William the Antichrist, and it melded with the intentional nods to Crompton and Just William and the strata of Englishness that Gaiman wanted to layer into the story. The result was a wry, oddball, and humorous style, not dissimilar to another book Gaiman had read recently, set on the back of a giant turtle and written by a full-time PR man who dressed a bit like a driving instructor, whom Gaiman now counted as a good friend. He sent copies of the story to several people whose opinion he respected, and because he had a vague idea that he could do for horror what The Colour of Magic had done for fantasy, one of those people was Terry Pratchett, who read it, was intrigued, and then metaphorically and indeed literally popped it in a drawer for later. On the surface, Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett are not obvious friends. Pratchett was 12 years older for a start, the son of a mechanic and a secretary, and his work ethic was shaped entirely by his working class background and a post-war culture of making the best of it. After leaving school, he'd trained diligently in his chosen profession. He'd spent his 20s and most of his 30s creating a settled and solid life in the country based around work and nature and family. Gaiman, meanwhile, was the son of a property broker who became the head of the Church of Scientology. He was a product of the 1960s and the 1970s, an era in which creativity and art and rebellion seeped into youth culture. At the age Pratchett discovered full-time work, Gaiman was discovering punk rock. He fronted a Lou Reed-influenced DIY punk band called the XXX, which is a brilliant name for a band, by the way, who played around the London scene, knocking out Bowie covers and the Stranglers and the New York Dolls, as well as a handful of Gaiman originals. Unlike Pratchett, who could charitably be called eccentric in his hooped sweaters and scraggly beard, Gaiman was cool. He was good-looking and tall. He wore a leather jacket and had unruly black hair. When the pair met, Pratchett was a company man who had worked for just two employers for the best part of a decade, whilst Gaiman was an odd job writer, taking on any work he could. He reviewed films and books and wrote features for top shelf magazines, and by top shelf magazines, I mean mucky magazines, including Penthouse and Knave, the latter of which he helped evolve, albeit briefly, into a classier lads mag. His career was an opportunity to write thousands of words about the pop culture he loved, with the added bonus of getting into gigs and movies for free, getting sent records and books to review, and interviewing his heroes, while, as Pratchett frequently noted, living off the free food laid on at press events. By 1985, Pratchett, supported by steady journalism and PR jobs, had published 4 books for the sheer pleasure of writing them. Gaiman had managed just one, a biography of the 1980s pop band Duran Duran, which he claims is the only thing he ever wrote for the paycheck alone, and he is never allowed to be reprinted. However, the pair soon found they shared common ground. Both had grown up in small towns in the southeast of England, Beaconsfield and East Grinstead, and both had their lives changed when they discovered the local library as children, uncovering a thirst for knowledge of all kinds, especially mythology, history, and science. Both had fallen deeply in love with The Lord of the Rings at a similarly impressionable age and found it a gateway to new worlds of the fantastic, where they discovered a universe of science fiction classics and joined the convention-dwelling fanzine-writing scene that dangled from its misshapen underbelly. Both had made their living from words, though Pratchett's route was structured and Gaiman's rather haphazard, and both had written a children's book as their first attempt at a novel, although Gaiman's My Great Aunt Ermintrude remains, alas, unpublished. They also shared a worldview and a sense of humour, both being huge fans of the eminently quotable G.K. Chesterton and P.J. Wodehouse. They made each other laugh and they could make each other excited. They'd meet regularly on the convention circuit and fell into the habit of long late-night phone conversations in which they'd read each other their latest work, which was invaluable for Gaiman as he began the move from journalism into fiction, even turning down an offer to be the full-time features editor of Penthouse, which, let me remind you, is a porn mag, in order to cultivate his growing reputation as a comic book author. By 1988, his work for Total Eclipse, 2000 AD, and especially his graphic novel Violent Cases, had gained the attention of DC Comics, the giant American publishers behind legendary comic titles like Batman and Superman and the Justice League. They were hoping to import back to the US some of the grit and the verve that was generating this renaissance in British comics. Gaiman had pitched a revival of a long-neglected DC title, The Sandman, reinvented as a dark modern fantasy. He was hip deep in the story, having been working hard for almost a year when Terry Pratchett called. Pratchett, now a full-time author, had stumbled across his forgotten copy of William the Antichrist and reread it, realizing that he knew what should happen next and that he wanted to be the one to write the story. He called Gaiman, offering to co-author the story, or, if he wasn't interested in pursuing it, buy the idea from him outright and write it himself. Gaiman agreed to collaborate almost on the spot. Later, he would often say that their collaboration was between two men yet to reach their potential as writers. In those days, Neil Gaiman was barely Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett only just Terry Pratchett, say the notes to the 2019 edition of Good Omens. Although by 1988, Pratchett was actually a bestseller with a growing audience and a ferocious work rate. Gaiman, who had yet to publish a novel, recognized that working alongside the older man would be a tremendous learning opportunity that would do no harm to his profile, besides which it would be fun. The pair began the process of long phone calls, mailed computer disks, and on one occasion, utilizing a primitive computer network that would result in a rough first draft. Pratchett got the ball rolling. He took Gaiman's initial 5,000 words and turned them into 10,000 words, including a complete redraft of the text, making major and minor tweaks. The Satanic Nurses became a coven of satanic nuns, because nuns are always funnier, always. And a character called Crawley, an ineffective demon who drove a Citroen 2CV and was looked down on by his demonic brethren, was given a makeover, becoming 2 characters. Pratchett changed the demon's name to Crowley, gave him a sneaky intelligence, a lot of swagger, and several character traits borrowed from Gaiman himself, including a tendency to wear sunglasses indoors and a black leather jacket. He also introduced the story's MacGuffin, a book of prophecies by a 17th century witch called Agnes Nutter. Quick pause here. If you don't know what a MacGuffin is, a MacGuffin is the object of a quest that drives the story along. So in Raiders of the Lost Ark, the MacGuffin is the Ark, not to be confused with a McMuffin, which is not the same thing unless the quest for a good breakfast gets really, really out of hand. Anyway. A book of prophecies by a 17th century witch called Agnes Nutter, who'd been burned by witch finders, and due to some carefully placed barrels of gunpowder, took her captors down with her. The character had been intended for a Discworld novel, but slotted neatly into the mythology of William the Antichrist. The ball was then batted back to Gaiman, who, since this was a book about the end of the world, added the 4 horsepersons of the apocalypse. The pair would spend hours on the phone, talking at least once a day to work on the plot and the characters before splitting off to write. Since they were working on a novel, that's Pratchett's territory, it was decided that he should be responsible for maintaining the continuity of the emerging story, dubbing himself, with no small irony, the keeper of the discs, and making sure that there was always a master draft to work from. He always maintained that had they been writing a comic, it would have been the other way around. By necessity, it was Terry that did the bulk of the typing. He estimated perhaps 2/3 of the typing, while Neil puts the split around 65,000 to 45,000 words. As Gaiman, who writes longhand, he had the relentless pace of the Sandman and other comics to keep on top of. Gaiman watched how Pratchett would weave and sew the narrative together. The plot and the characters and the ideas, however, they were a 50-50 split. Gaiman was busy with the Sandman, but he would always, regardless of the time, write 500 words of William the Antichrist before he went to bed, sometimes mailing a disc to Pratchett to be sewn into the master draft, sometimes talking it through the next day. Pratchett was a habitual early riser, as country people often are, and did much of his work in the morning. Gaiman would emerge from bed, bleary-eyed, much later in the day to find his answer phone blinking, which I think might be why there are so many answer phones in Good Omens. And he would call Pratchett back, and they would talk each other through their work from the morning and the previous night. Much like Beatles fans who try and spot a Lennon song or a McCartney song, fans of Pratchett and Gaiman have spent 30 years now debating which author was responsible for which idea and which piece of writing. Now, Pratchett initially wrote the sections featuring the Them, the gang of scabby-kneed kids led by the eponymous juvenile Antichrist, then still called William. On the surface, the gang are clearly nodding to Crompton's Just William books, but scratch a little and you'll find Terry's own childhood in 40 Green in Beaconsfield, right down to the local American airbase and the copse of trees that formed a den for the gang to play in. It was Pratchett that added another important what if to the original plan. What if, in the Omen sequels, Damien had had free will to do with his powers as he pleased? Gaiman, meanwhile, he was responsible for the 4 horsemen and the motorcycle gang that followed them along, and much of the story involving Crowley and his angel counterpart Aziraphale. The beginning of the book was Gaiman's, the end was Pratchett's. However, each rewrote the other sections to the point that the lines became completely blurred beyond recognition, especially as each was basing their work on ideas that came out of joint conversations. Both worked on the major characters. And as the finale approached, Gaiman took over the writing of the Them, while Pratchett inherited the Horsemen. It's interesting to note that while the skeletal figure of Death bears a close resemblance to the benevolent Reaper of the Discworld, right down to his manner of speaking, that was me trying to do capital letters. It doesn't really work out loud, does it? This Death was written predominantly by Gaiman and is a far darker, less kindly character than Pratchett's. Gaiman, of course, would have eventually create his own character, Death, who was a lot sexier than Terry Pratchett's character, Death. In response, Terry would create his own character called the Sandman. Again, Neil Gaiman's Sandman is much sexier. There's a theme there, isn't there? Now, there's an assumption that Gaiman wrote the nastier sections of the book and Pratchett the nicer bits. And to an extent, that's true. The broad strokes of the plot, the horror story, that's Gaiman's. And so are some of the grisly ideas, like when the demon Hasta manifests out of a phone in the form of thousands of maggots. The tone at the end of the story is Pratchett's. It was him that insisted that any damage done in the story would have to be undone. There could be no blood on their child protagonist's hands. And it must be the boy's free will that ultimately saves the world. It wasn't as black and white as that, though. Both could write with warmth and with humanity, or with a sneaking nastiness. Later, Gaiman would say that it was a gross oversimplification to view the book as a meeting of his tendency towards the macabre and Pratchett's sweetness and light. The two friends approached their work from exactly the same mindset and knew the tone they wanted to achieve, which was somewhere between Crompton, Adams, Wodehouse, and Chesterton, with a modern horror twist. They would rewrite each other, throwing in jokes and footnotes until often they were unsure who had written which bit, joking that there was whole sections of the book neither of them could remember writing at all. Mostly, it became a game of making each other laugh. And then, as Gaiman's biographer Hayley Campbell put it in her 2016 book, The Art of Neil Gaiman, which is excellent, by the way, racing each other to the good bits. Now, the first draft was completed in just 9 weeks, with the pair working separately. Then the second draft took another 4 months as they sort of came together to tame their wild, partially structured idea into a kind of coherent whole. They gender swapped the characters of Pepper and War, and they refined the plot down. Neil travelled to Somerset to stay in Terry's cottage so the two could nudge their opus over the finishing line. He remembers one morning finding 2 doves that had escaped from the Terry and Lynn's dovecote just wheeling around his room in a state of panic. He just assumed that sort of thing happened all the time. Apparently, that never happened to anybody else. One of the final jobs was to come up with a new title. As the book had evolved, the character of William had been renamed Adam. Therefore, William the Antichrist, with its double nods to just William and William the Conqueror, had to be changed, and Adam the Antichrist would have none of the associations they wanted. More to the point, it was clear that this wasn't just Adam's story. A full cast list included at the start of the book made that obvious. If anything, Crowley and Aziraphale had become the heroes of the piece. It was Gaiman who thought of calling the book Good Omens, putting on the omen, while Pratchett favoured the nice and accurate prophecies of Agnes Nutter, which a compromise was reached by making Pratchett's suggestion the subtitle and putting Neil's snappier suggestion at the top. Good Omens, the nice and accurate prophecies of Agnes Nutter, witch. Uniquely in Pratchett's career as a professional author, Good Omens had been written on spec. Since The Carpet People in 1971, he'd been operating on commission, with fees and deals organised before he started work on a book, and a publisher already lined up. Good Omens was different. Pratchett and Gaiman had written it off their own backs, fitting it in alongside their other work. Later, Pratchett would describe it as a summer job. The book was done, but the job wasn't finished. Terry often said as a piece of writing wasn't complete until it had been read by its intended audience, an instinct he learned as a journalist. The circle had to be closed. It was time to find a publisher. To their delight, Good Omens prompted that most exciting of publishing traditions, the bidding war. The rights were auctioned publicly by Gaiman's agents, Writers House, and were ultimately won in the UK by Gollancz and Corgi, handling the paperback. Those were Terry's publishers, because neither company was about to let one of its most successful talents drift into the path of a rival. Interest from other publishers, though, ensured a much higher advance than Pratchett was accustomed to, a numerically satisfying, see if I can get this right, £150,150, £150, which the authors split evenly. Pratchett was ecstatic, while Gaiman, naturally, played the whole thing down. Though it's hard to believe that a writer selling their first novel for a £75,000 share wasn't dancing a jig inside. An additional deal was done with the US publisher, Wortman, for the American rights. Pratchett was at best an underground name in the States at the time, while the roaring success of The Sandman had made Gaiman a force to be reckoned with. So in America, the book is credited to Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett, while back in the UK, the reliable bestseller Pratchett is treated as the headline name. Good Omens was advertised with the strapline, funnier than Stephen King, scarier than Tom Sharp, and was an immediate success, well received on both sides of the Atlantic. Wickedly funny. The theological debates top even The Life of Brian. Good Omens is heaven to read and you'll laugh like hell. Wrote a breathless time out, and you might recognize the second bit of that quote because it appeared on all of the jackets of Good Omens for years. For the first time, Pratchett found his work under the gaze of American broadsheet critics, though the New York Times' Joe Queenan absolutely hated the book, saying it had reams and reams of undergraduate dreck and recycled science fiction cliche. Joe Queenan, I think, was probably in a bit of a mood that day because his review also moans a lot about Benny Hill, East End pubs, and people from Liverpool. I have no idea what was happening, but it was a stinker of a review. Oh, hang on. I clicked on a footnote, and now I've got to get back to my place. Go back. Damn it. Sorry, there we go. The Washington Post, meanwhile, delivered a glowing write-up. It's a wow. And the San Diego Tribune review positively vibrated with joy, a steamroller of silliness that made me giggle out loud. As Pratchett and Gaiman embarked on a promotional tour that took in the US and the UK, they started to realize that they had written something that resonated deeply with readers. Over the years, they were rarely asked to sign a pristine copy of Good Omens unless it was being bought as a gift or as a replacement for a lost or worn out book. Instead, they were handed paperbacks with crinkled and folded pages and creased covers, sometimes held together with tape, and not infrequently swollen and deformed where they'd been dropped in the bath or a hotel swimming pool. Good Omens was a book that people truly loved and read over and over again. They lent it to their friends and bought copies to give as gifts. Word of mouth spread quickly and a wave of affection hurried after it. For the rest of their careers, it was rare for either writer to do an interview, a signing session, or a Q&A without being asked about their collaboration. The icing on the cake came with 2 award nominations, Best Novel at the World Fantasy Awards and Best Fantasy Novel at the respected Locus Awards. Now, touring Good Omens solidified their friendship. Working together on the book is one thing, but to spend several weeks sharing a hotel room is to truly know someone. The pair developed an odd couple double act, entertaining panel audiences by one-upping each other for the best laughs, putting Terry's hat and Neil's jacket on a chair to illustrate the real writer of the book, a composite entity called Neil and Terry. In a hotel room at the World Fantasy Con in Seattle, months before the book was even out, Pratchett chastised Gaiman for getting in late, saying, "Your mother and I have been very worried." I'm assured that was the voice he did. And the pair lay on their twin beds in the dark, planning out a sequel, which they provisionally and brilliantly titled 668, The Neighbor of the Beast. The tour was full of adventures that both remembered fondly. The time they had to keep a straight face during a radio interview in New York because the DJ had assumed that the book was the factual account of a real historical old witch whose prophecies came true. There was the hotel where Gaiman's TV could only tune into porn and Pratchett's could only show Mr. Ed. And the adventure Pratchett mysteriously referred to as the time they met the Spider Woman. We don't know anything about that story. Ask Neil on the thing later. When Neil does his panel later, ask him about the Spider Woman because I really want to know. In San Francisco, they decided to walk to a radio interview and turned up 40 minutes late, livid with themselves for misjudging the distance. Gaiman wrote in his foreword to a slip of the keyboard, which is a collection of Terry's nonfiction, saying it was the first time that he detected the simmering anger that lay below the surface of his friend's jolly demeanor and fueled his best writing. Now, this is where we get pertinent to the show, because discussions about a Good Omens movie began before the book was even in shops. It was such an obviously filmic story full of appealing visuals and compelling characters that Hollywood took notice immediately, probably helped by the fact the Washington Post had literally said it would make one hell of a movie. The publishers sent a copy to Monty Python star and cult filmmaker Terry Gilliam, hoping that he would provide a quote to go on the cover to sit alongside those by Clive Barker and James Herbert. They also sent one to the comic book writer Robert Crumb, but that didn't go very well. He sent a lengthy letter back to the publishers begging them never to publish the book. But anyway, somehow Gilliam's accompanying note was lost. So Gilliam assumed he'd been sent the book for consideration as a movie. And he began negotiating for the rights straight away, although ultimately, for whatever reason, the discussions went nowhere. The rights ended up with a company called Sovereign Pictures, a film financing firm which had had success with an Oscar-winning film called My Left Foot and a version of Hamlet starring Mel Gibson. Sovereign, like a lot of Hollywood, was a very money-focused company. They were not driven by creative ambition. Its involvement marks the point where Good Omens began its journey, appropriately enough, given the story, to development hell, which is a lot like regular hell, except all of the demons are busily scrubbing up people's ideas to make them less interesting. Now, there was always a sense that Hollywood didn't really get Good Omens. Pratchett and Gaiman traveled to LA and they endured meeting after meeting with producers, most of whom insisted that the original author should write the screenplay, but wanted to impress upon them how much of the book would need to be changed. Gaiman remembers one meeting with a studio exec. He remains tight-lipped on who, although if you do a bit of research, you can find out, who outlined a vision that would see Newt Pulsifer played by a Tom Cruise type, with Julia Roberts starring as, and I quote, anathema whatever. A scene involving a Japanese whaling ship also caused problems, since Sovereign was hoping to get a Japanese firm to invest. Would it be okay, they asked, if the whaling ship were to be made Dutch instead? There is no tradition of whaling in the Netherlands. The authors would sit through meetings and then they'd head back to their hotel to work on a new story outline based on the studio's notes, only to find that no one was bothering to read them anyway. The plot twisted and turned this way and that. As Pratchett and Gaiman pillaged their planned sequel for new characters that could expand the world of the book, they eventually delivered a script that departed from the original novel quite a bit. They added a new action sequence, including one where angels in the British Museum use their halos as killer frisbees, which is an idea that turned up in an episode of Doctor Who by purely coincidence. And Neil, of course, would revisit the idea of angels in the British Museum in his book and his TV show Neverwhere. And I think that those that originated whilst they were writing the Good Omens script. Sovereign Films were still unhappy and they asked for another draft that would move even further away from the original novel. And at this point, Pratchett threw up his hands and walked away from the project, urging Neil to do the same. Sadly, it wasn't that simple. The contract they'd signed meant that Sovereign had every right to demand a second draft of the script, and they could potentially sue if one were not forthcoming. Gaiman stayed on to try again, this time setting the story in America, much to Pratchett's dismay, and abandoning key characters such as the Four Horsemen. This version was rejected, this time, maddeningly, for departing too far from the source material. Thankfully, Sovereign Pictures then went bankrupt, so before much work could be done, and the rights reverted back to the authors, although they both found that their enthusiasm for a Good Omens movie had basically evaporated. Working on the screenplay had actually put a dent in their relationship as well. Gaiman admits to some friction, but he does say it was short-lived, telling the Times in 2015 that Terry was grumpy with me for a couple of years, but he went back to being friends because it was easier. He missed me and I missed him. Nevertheless, the Good Omens movie was not dead. In 1999, British film producers Pete and Mark Samuelson approached Pratchett and Gaiman about the rights. Now, Pratchett was skeptical. He usually was. But Gaiman felt that the Samuelson brothers understood the fundamentals of the story, especially when they approached a delighted Terry Gilliam, remember him, to write and direct. Now, things were at last moving forward. Details of Gilliam's script, written with a regular collaborator called Tony Grissoni, now they're thin on the ground. We don't know what Gilliam had planned, though he did say the ending of the story would have been very different from the novel. He gave a quote to a movie website saying, with each pass, it becomes even more loosely based on the book, and perhaps the fans will never speak to us again. Together, Gilliam and the Samuelsons had secured $50 million in funding from Renaissance Pictures and had provisionally lined up Johnny Depp and Robin Williams to play Crowley and Aziraphale, and Kirsten Dunst to play Anathema, which is a really, really good cast. Gaiman and Pratchett were both happy to stay clear of the project and let him get on with it. They were both huge Gilliam fans, and Pratchett considered the classic film Time Bandits, Terry Gilliam's Time Bandits, to be one of his favorite films ever. He was, however, a realist and continually stated in interviews that he doubted the film would ever get made. He was right. It needed an American distributor to guarantee transatlantic success and to make up for the rest of its predicted $60 million budget. Sadly, in the paranoid and cautious period that followed the September the 11th attacks in New York, no one in Hollywood was looking to invest in a movie about the end of the world. With only 80% of the budget raised and no American distribution in place, support began to slip away. Gilliam was still hoping to get Good Omens off the ground as late as 2006, but it wasn't meant to be. The rights eventually reverted back to Pratchett and Gaiman, and it would be several years yet before the old girl, as Terry had taken to calling the project, eventually made it to the screens, this time re-envisioned, as you know, as a prestige television show. Pratchett wouldn't live to see the lavish production of his old girl that debuted on Amazon Prime in 2019, though he and Gaiman did provide cameos as traffic policemen in a 2014 radio adaptation that aired on the BBC just before Christmas. The 2019 TV show, more of which later, was written by Gaiman, more of which later in the book, more of all of it for you guys. The TV show, I mean, I don't need to tell you this, was written by Gaiman, who took on the role of showrunner as a labor of love with complete control over the project. It was rapturously received, and thanks to Amazon's heavy marketing, found a whole new audience, much of which now wanting to read the book that had inspired their new favorite show. In the spring of 2019, almost 30 years after it was first published, Good Omens, The Nice and Accurate Prophecies of Agnes Nutter Witch, entered the New York Times bestseller list for the first time. And that's that. That's the thing. That's the chapter. I hope you enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun to write. It's one of my favorite bits of the book. I really liked dedicating an entire chapter to Good Omens because I really love it. There's more about Good Omens at the end in the final chapter where I talk about how the TV show got made. But well, I've got at least something for you to find out about and actually bother to read the book. Otherwise, this is rather a pointless endeavor. So yeah, that was that. Thanks for listening. I hope you are still listening. Let's do some Q&A.
Yes, everyone is still listening. The chat has gone very, very quickly, which has been lovely.
So do pop any questions that you have in the Q&A tab. We will get started with some that have been asked in advance. So the first one is, you say in the book that you never actually got to meet Terry. And so it must have been quite difficult to write about. And a thing that comes up over and over again throughout the book is that he's quite an unreliable narrator of his own life. Yes. So sometimes you're in situations where you just have to repeat an anecdote and say, here's the evidence that doesn't quite stack up, make of it what you will. How difficult did that make the writing process?
It did make it hard, yeah. It's true, Terry is an unreliable narrator. Terry preferred to tell a good story. And it didn't necessarily have to be a true story. So often he would simplify his anecdotes, and then he'd trot those simplified versions that were a little bit polished, a little bit more funny into interviews, and he'd trot them out over years and years and years, saying the same version until he'd almost forgotten which one was true. He actually said that once, that you get to a point where you forget which was the polished version and what had really happened. I don't think it made it difficult. In fact, I think it made it more interesting, because it's not something I dislike about Terry. It's actually something I really, really like about him. It's like words and stories are so important to him that he couldn't even help himself from polishing his own. What I liked about that is it meant that it was more challenging for me. I had to go on a hunt and find out the story. Like, I got to the point where I was like, I cannot believe a fact that's been in a Terry interview. So if it sounds too good to be true, I need to research it more. And luckily you can. I mean, I interviewed people, I read so many articles, so many interviews going back to the 1970s, and you find the places where the stories like converge. Like it's like Terry's agent Colin talks about how like when asked about how Terry got his book deal, Terry would always say, I picked up the phone book, I looked up local publishers, and I sent my book to a publisher, and the first publisher agreed to publish it. He said that so many times. He used to send that out to people as a response in fan mail if they asked him how he got his book deal. It's completely bollocks. What happened was that Terry was working for a local newspaper, and he interviewed a local publisher, got on really well with them, became friends with them over the course of several months, and only when he got a relationship with them, sheepishly said, by the way, I've written a book, would you be interested in it? There's a lot of stories like that, but I actually really enjoyed the challenge of finding the real stories, and then sometimes you're not sure which is which, you're not sure which is the real version. So it's what Terry talks a lot in his books about the trousers of time. You know, you go down a different path of the trousers of time. Life splits in two and goes down different directions. I like to think that both versions of the stories are true. So just depending on which bit of the trousers of time you're in. So I try and present Terry's story and the things I've been able to find out, and I just leave it to you to decide which version of the truth you'd like to believe.
Yeah, that is a really nice way to do it. Some more questions?
Plenty of questions, yes. Right, I think I'm going to start at the bottom, try and work my way up.
As the vicar said to the Vestal Virgin.
Doesn't it? Yes, indeed. If you've never read any of Terry Pratchett's books, which would you recommend to start with? We know there's a lot of recommendations out there, but what would be your personal recommendation?
That is the single most common question about Pratchett's work. I mean, Good Omens is a very good place to start, I think. And if you haven't read Good Omens, I mean, I know a lot of people who are fans of the show haven't necessarily read the book, and that's absolutely fine. It's its own thing, but it is brilliant. Discworld, Pratchett always said Mort was a good place to start. I think that's a relatively safe choice, very self-contained. Personally, I would go a little bit further along, because the books get more interesting as you go along. They get a bit richer. Something like Feet of Clay, I think, is a great starting point. Guards is a great starting point. The great thing about the first sort of 20 or so Discworld novels is you don't really need to read them in any order. After that, you kind of need a bit of knowledge, but the first half of the series, you can basically start anywhere. But I think Feet of Clay is a really interesting choice because you've got quite a dark, intelligent story, but it's also very funny. It's where that series of books, the Watch books, really start to hit their stride, I think. So that's the one I'd recommend. Also, I think Truckers is a really brilliant book, which isn't Discworld, but Truckers is amazing. And Nation as well. Nation is, I think Nation is a masterpiece. So basically, any of them. Just read any of them.
Yes, a lot happening, all good by the sounds of it. Okay, more questions. Promotional question here. Any chance of getting an audiobook version?
I would love an audiobook version. It's down to my publisher. I've asked, and they've said we need to wait and see how the book does, and then I have a feeling I'll probably end up narrating it myself, which means it will be delivered far too quickly. But that's to be TBC. I'd love to do an audiobook. What I'd really like to do is to get Paul Kay to do it, who did the who played Terry in the Back to Black documentary, because then he could do Terry's voice whenever he's doing quotes. That'd be amazing. Stephen Briggs would be brilliant as well, but I don't think the Pratchett estate would let him do it. But and also I don't think I can afford him. But I'd love to do an audiobook. It's just a matter of, it's a small publisher, it's a small release, so we'll see. Worst comes to worst, I'll do one myself. I think I've done readings of about 6 of the chapters now, so if you do a bit of research, you can basically piece your own together.
Good stuff. We like that. Watch this space then, I think. Jojo asks, was there ever a point where you felt like your project had grown too big? Have you ever had that feeling, and how, if so, did you deal with it?
That's a great question. Writing the book, I mean, anyone who's written a book will tell you that you get you get your book deal, you get your contract, particularly with non-fiction. Fiction, you submitted a finished book. Non-fiction, you submit a chapter and an idea, and then you write it. And you get your contract back, and in my case, it said 70,000 words, and you go, oh, that's an intimidating 70,000 words. Wow, I've never written anything longer than 5,000 words before. And then, I worked out the chapters and sort of divided it up. And then it didn't take me very long to realize that every single chapter was ending up twice as long as I meant it to be. And I ended up having to subdivide the story further. And then I'd go back and I'd redraft my plan. And the estimated word count would go up and up and up until I realized that the word count I was planning was going to be like 120,000 words. And it got, at that point, it got scary, not because I didn't think I was going to be able to write enough. It was because I felt, you say that the task was too big. It never felt especially overwhelming. I just kind of got on with it. I made the mistake I made with this book was that I wanted to get it out by the Discworld convention this year, because I thought that'd be a brilliant opportunity to sell them, and they're only every 2 years, obviously. So I should have had another 6 months to write it, but my publisher said, well, if you can get it in by end of September 2019, we can get it out in time for summer 2020. So I did that at great cost to my mental health. I think that's not an exaggeration. I delivered the book, and I think eventually it was as good a book as it would have been if I'd had longer to do it. I just compressed it all down, and then of course COVID comes along, and the Discworld convention got cancelled. So thanks for that. But yeah, it never felt too big a job. I think I just kind of got on with it. The thing is, it was fun to write. Like, organizing it wasn't fun. Finding the time to write it wasn't fun. But the actual writing was fun. And when I was actually writing it, I enjoyed it, so it was fine. The bit that was really overwhelming was the pre-orders, because I slightly underestimated how many people would be interested in a pre-order. I thought I'll buy 100 copies from the publisher and sell them myself as special editions. So I did that, and then they all sold out. So I ordered 100 more, and they all sold out. So I got 100 more. And then what eventually happened is, just before the book came out, a truck turned up with 500 books for me on a pallet to our small South London flat that ended up being piled behind me in our spare room. And I realized I had to sign all of them, and I had to do all the packaging and everything. And that felt overwhelming. That felt like an impossible task. But I just sort of sat watching TV for about 2 weeks, doing nothing but signing books. And eventually and some people came around to help, and eventually we got it all sorted.
We can sympathise with that. That sounds like us dealing with convention t-shirts.
Yes, we have many t-shirts and many prize packs currently in our spare room. That sounds marvellous, except for the piece about the mental health, of course. This year hasn't been kind, and I imagine rushing a project like that to fruition for an event that got cancelled must have been
yeah, in that respect, this year has been kinder than last year was.
Bless you. Hopefully I don't know whether you'll find this an easy one to answer. Do you have a favourite character in Good Omens? Little Ocean asks.
I think my favourite character has always been Aziraphale in Good Omens. I mean, I'm always a sucker for the oddballs. I like Crowley, but he's too cool. Like, I can't relate to Crowley. Aziraphale's slightly bumbling nature and willingness to always assume the best of people at his own cost is something I relate to quite a lot. So I've always thought he was an adorable character. It's probably a more interesting answer, but I can't think of it. Sister Mary Loquacious as well. The whole concept of the Order of the Chattering Nuns is incredible. I love that concept. So that.
They are the bumbling incompetence.
Yes,
generally.
They are.
I'm always a sucker for.
Unless you're trying to caption them.
Yes,
I think is what we learned yesterday. But they certainly were wonderful. Tad asks, what was the most surprising thing about Terry that you found out during your book writing process?
I mean, the most surprising thing was the thing about him finessing his own story quite a lot. That was I didn't really think about that. But think that would happen. But that was interesting when the penny dropped that I realized that I was going to have to I couldn't take things he'd said at face value. There'd always going to be a step further. Outside of that, I think what surprised me is that there are no hidden sides to Terry that we knew about. Like the person the person you think you know, even if you only read his books, seems to be the person he was. And that is that's not always true. But the kind of the moral heart of his books is really his moral heart, and you can see that through his life, and you can see right from his early years and the work he did as a journalist, you can sort of see that developing, and that's really, really nice. So that was a pleasant surprise. I didn't expect to find anything bad, but I really like how well he represented himself like that. A lot of people have said, you don't need a book about Terry because you've got Terry's books. And whilst I would urge people to consider that they maybe do need a book about Terry, I also think there is some truth in that.
That was a good answer. I enjoyed that. I think it's when you have a favourite character or TV personality, or there is always that not wanting to know anymore just in case. And I think it's lovely when someone favoured, real or fictional, turns out not to have hidden sides in any way, shape or form.
I mean, we don't know the full person because nobody, you'd have to be very close. There are people close to him who knew him a lot better than I did, but a lot of the people who did know him very well and did talk to me didn't give me the impression that there was a darker side.
So I think that actually gives us quite a nice segue into the next question from Maddie. What was your favourite part of working on the project? Did you have a favourite interview or a particularly fun chapter to write?
My favourite interview, no question, bar none, is I interviewed Nigel Planer, who was the narrator of the first dozen or so, I think there's about 25 Discworld audiobooks. He contacted, I had a tweet that went viral during my research. I found this quote from Terry where he'd interviewed Bill Gates in the 90s about the future of the internet and had been basically spot on about it. So I tweeted it and it went massively viral. And Nigel Planer like got in touch with me and said, "Oh, I did the audiobooks. I met him a few times. If you ever want to chat, then please do." Now, if you don't know who Nigel Planer is, Nigel Planer was in a TV show called The Young Ones in the early 1980s. A British comedy show, which I grew up on and can quote every episode of verbatim. Like, there's a recording of me and my younger brother in the doing a skit from the young Ones when we were like 9 and 10. Like, so I got to have lunch with Nigel Planer, and we talked about Terry Pratchett. I didn't even end up using very much of it, but just having the lunch was brilliant. Chapters that were good, fun to write. The early stuff was really good because it was a lot of stuff that I didn't know, that people generally didn't know. So Terry's life in the 70s as a journalist, and there's a lot of stuff I found out that people just, I talked to a lot of old colleagues of his, stuff that's never been sort of been mentioned in interviews and things like that, and got some really good anecdotes. So that was the best period to like. And then I liked the nerding out bits as well. I go quite deep on the books, so I got to nerd out about the books a lot. And I just, those bits I didn't, the bits I didn't even have to research because it's just out of my head. It's just, this is what I think about this book. Those were really satisfying just because I could just go full on Discworld geek.
Amazing. Full on Discworld geek. I think there are several joining you in the chat currently.
And also a massive fan club forming for your wife.
I was just about to say, big Georgia Tennant energy has been mentioned. Couples goals, much love going on in the chat. You'll have to come in.
I'm very excited to read that back. At Nicoletta Wild on Twitter. Follow her on Twitter.
We have that in the chat. So before we let you go, we have a few minutes left. I wondered if you wanted to share anything truly promotional with us. That Nicoletta's been doing a great job in the chat, but is there anything that you wanted to share with the attendees today?
The most useful thing you can do is join my mailing list. That'd be really good. I think Nick will have put the thing in the chat to join my mailing list. And that I'm in the middle of writing a new book now, which is going to be about Mark Bolan and David Bowie, which is a bit of a departure. Although I wrote a newsletter last week about how I think there's a lot of crossover between the worlds that they all created and with the worlds that Terry created. So I would if you want to be, and there's going to be more stuff about Terry and more nerdy things like that. I'm going to do some extra editions and bonus material and things. So please do follow the mailing list. That's the most useful thing. And follow me on Twitter at 20th Century Mark, because that's basically what I do with my life. I should should help some friends. If you're interested in Neil Gaiman, this book was brilliant for the research. The Art of Neil Gaiman by Hayley Campbell, who's a friend of mine. It's really good. It's really good. So I heartily recommend that. But other than that, please buy my book. Buy it on Amazon. Leave a review.
Can we also give a huge shout out to your cover artist as well?
Oh, Andrea is so good. Yes, thank you for reminding me.
Fandom favorite, Andrea White.
If you haven't seen her Good Omens book on our own side, is so good. I couldn't believe my luck when she gave me permission to use the picture of Terry, to use this picture of Terry. I think that picture has sold more copies of this book than anything else has.
I'm also going to take the opportunity in that case, as you've mentioned Andrea's art book, we'll do a bit of mutual promotion here. One of the prizes for this evening's quiz.
It is indeed.
Gentle Peeps.
And it has that picture in it, doesn't it?
Yes. So Andrea's book has that picture in it and is absolutely beautiful and makes a perfect frontispiece for Mark's work. I think you will agree.
And Mark does also have a booth at the convention. So do visit it. If the links or whizzed by in the chat too quickly, you can find the link to purchase it there.
Yeah, and the chat will remain here as well for 30 days, so you can come back in and see the sterling work that Nicoletta has been doing.
Yeah, the word, I guess the one thing I would say, and it's the most useful thing you can do for any author, is just spread the word. Just tell people about it if you enjoy the book. Leave reviews on Amazon and Goodreads. like talk about it on Twitter. That is like the most single useful thing you can do for any author. And you know, I'm as a small author, as a small publisher, I'm not famous, so I need the help. But that's the most useful thing anyone can do.
Yeah, I have not left a review on Amazon yet because busy running a convention, but that is on my to-do list for next week.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It has been an absolute pleasure both to listen and to have the opportunity to do Q&A. Lots of new fans in the chat, new and old, I think. So thank you very, very much for joining us.
This has been really lovely. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the weekend. I will see you in the chat and stuff.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye.